The silence in the mansion the Hawthorne estate stood like a fortress of glass and marble against the rolling countryside. A house so large it cast shadows across its own gardens by the time the sun began to set. The walls gleamed white, polished, every day by staff who were instructed never to leave a single smudge on the glossy surfaces. The manicured hedges along the driveway cut with such precision that they looked as though they had been sculpted rather than grown. From a distance, it seemed like perfection and empire made of stone, steel, and money. But anyone who had ever lived or worked inside those walls knew that perfection was a performance, a mask carefully adjusted each morning before the world looked in. And behind that mask, silence often screamed louder than words. Maya Daniels had been in the Hawthorne household for less than 2 months, and already she had learned that silence was a dangerous thing here. She had been hired as part of the service staff. Her official role was domestic aid, but everyone knew what that meant. She was the maid, the one who tidied the rooms, folded the laundry, polished the fixtures, and, most importantly, stayed invisible. The first rule was always the same: do not be noticed. A good maid is one that blends into the walls, leaves no trace of herself, and remembers her place. That was what Connie, the head housekeeper, had told her on the first day. Maya had nodded, though inside she'd felt a quiet resistance. She had taken the job because she needed money badly. Her debts weighed heavy, and her son's medical bills from years ago still haunted her credit like ghosts that never rested. But the moment she had set eyes on the boy who lived here, something inside her shifted. Ethan Hawthorne, known to everyone in the house as simply Eli, was 9 years old. Though his body looked closer to 6, he had a rare congenital heart condition, the kind that made his skin pale, his breath shallow, and his life fragile. Maya had seen him once on her second day, sitting alone in the grand sunroom, clutching a blanket while the light poured through the glass ceiling. He had looked up at her with wide, curious eyes that seemed far too old for his face. She had smiled, not expecting anything, but to her surprise, he had smiled back. A small flicker of warmth in a place that often felt like ice. From that moment, Maya couldn't help noticing him in the quiet ways no one else did. When his breathing turned uneven during the night, when he shivered in the mornings though the thermostat was set high, when he pressed his hand against his chest as though holding himself together, she noticed because she had once noticed these things in her own child, long ago, before the world had taken him from her. And she had sworn silently that she would never again ignore such signs in another child, not while she still drew breath. The other staff treated Eli like a burden, though few said it outright. Connie, stiff and tight-lipped, muttered that the boy was delicate and not our problem. Jerome, the groundskeeper, rarely spoke of him at all, and when he did, it was usually to complain about the medical equipment deliveries that cluttered the driveway. Even the nurses who rotated through on shifts seemed distant, their care more clinical than kind. And then there was Janelle, Richard Hawthorne's partner, who embodied coldness with every diamond she wore and every command she issued. She was not Eli's mother. His mother had passed years earlier, but Janelle wore the title of Lady of the House, as though she had been born to it. To her, Eli was not a child but an inconvenience, a fragile reminder of a family she hadn't built but had inherited, like a piece of furniture she didn't want in the room. She spoke of him rarely, but when she did, it was always with irritation. Maya had once overheard her say to Richard during dinner, "He's sick again. You need to consider how this looks, Richard. Investors notice weakness." That had chilled Maya more than the marble floors ever could. Richard himself was a more complicated figure. Tall, commanding, with a voice that filled any room he entered, he carried himself like the billionaire he was, the kind of man who saw the world as a balance sheet where every risk and reward could be calculated. Yet behind the stern lines of his face there was something Maya couldn't quite name. A father's grief, perhaps, or guilt. He loved his son, she didn't doubt that, but love in his world was expressed through wealth, through doctors flown in from overseas, through machines that beeped and blinked, through security systems that ensured no harm could enter the gates. What he didn't seem to understand, or perhaps refuse to, was that love wasn't only machines and money, it was presence, it was attention, it was the warmth of a hand held through the night. And in that house, Maya had begun to realize, those were the things Eli had the least of. One stormy evening, everything changed. The power had gone out, an unusual occurrence for a house so fortified, but the wangs that night had been vicious, tearing branches from trees and rattling the iron gates until even the cameras flickered out. The emergency generators failed for reasons no one could explain, and suddenly the mansion was plunged into darkness. Flashlights scattered in the hands of staff, and Richard himself was away on business, unreachable, while Janelle locked herself in her suite complaining of the inconvenience. It was in that silence, broken only by the patter of rain against the glass, that Maya heard the sound that made her blood run cold. A soft thump, followed by the faintest gasp of breath. She dropped the basket of towels she was folding and ran down the hall, her footsteps echoing across the polished marble, until she reached Eli's room. There, on the floor beside his bed, lay the boy. He was curled on his side, clutching his chest, his lips tinted with blue. His breaths came in shallow, ragged pulls, each one weaker than the last. Maya froze for a second, a terrible déjà vu washing over her. This was Tyler all over again, her son, gone before he had a chance to grow, the memory that haunted her sleep. She shook herself out of it, dropped to her knees, and pressed 2 fingers to Eli's neck. His pulse was faint, his skin clammy. "Eli, sweetie, look at me," she whispered desperately. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. His small hand twitched against hers. Panic rose in her chest, but instinct overrode it. She scooped him into her arms, his lightness terrifying, and stumbled into the hallway. "Help! Someone, please!" she cried. Connie appeared at the end of the corridor, her flashlight casting long shadows, but her face was unreadable. "He's not breathing right," Maya said, her voice cracking. "We need to get him to a hospital," but Connie only frowned. "You need to calm down. We can't do anything without Mr. Hawthorne's permission." Jerome stepped out from a side door, his expression flat. "We're not risking our jobs over something that ain't our call. He's not your kid." "Don't make this your problem," Maya's jaw dropped. "He could die," she shouted. "Then call an ambulance." "Phones are dead," Connie replied simply. "And unless you've got a miracle in your pocket, there's nothing more we can do." Maya's heart pounded in her ears. The boy wheezed faintly in her arms, his head lolling against her shoulder. "No time," she whispered to herself. She turned and ran toward the east wing, the place she wasn't supposed to go, the study that was locked at all times. Her hands shook as she set Eli gently against the wall and dug a small fruit knife from her apron pocket. With trembling precision, she jammed it into the lock. The tumblers clicked, the door swung open, and she stumbled inside. The office was sleek and cold, dominated by a mahogany desk and shelves of leather-bound books. On the wall, hidden behind a panel she had once glimpsed Richard opening, sat a safe. To her shock, it wasn't locked, whether by carelessness or arrogance, she didn't know. Inside, stacks of cash gleamed under the beam of her flashlight. Her hands darted forward, grabbing a roll of bills thick enough to cover any emergency. The moment she touched it, an alarm blared, red lights flashing. The house shook with sound, but Maya didn't flinch. She seized the Tesla key fob lying on the desk, bundled Eli tighter into a blanket, and bolted down the hall. The staff shouted after her, but she didn't stop. She reached the garage, hit the key fob, and the sleek black Tesla roared to life. With Eli strapped carefully into the passenger seat, she floored the accelerator, the tires screeching against wet pavement. Rain lashed the windshield, thunder rolled above, and the alarm's echo still rang in her ears as she tore down the estate drive. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, her hands gripping the wheel. "Just hold on." By the time she skidded into the emergency bay at Mercy Hills Hospital, her clothes were soaked, her breath ragged, and her heart pounding with fear. She burst through the doors, Eli limp in her arms, and screamed for help. Nurses rushed forward, snatching him from her grasp, their voices sharp and urgent as they wheeled him down the hall. Maya collapsed against the counter, chest heaving. For the first time in years, she felt both terror and relief intertwining. She had done it. She had gotten him here in time, but as the sound of sirens faded into the storm, new footsteps approached. A uniformed officer stepped into the rain dripping from his cap, his eyes fixed on Maya. "Maya Daniels?" he asked, where Eli had been taken. "I wasn't stealing," she said desperately. "I was saving him." The officer didn't answer. And in that moment, Maya realized the truth. Saving a child's life had cost her freedom. Shackles in the rain still poured heavily against the glass doors of Mercy Hills Hospital as the patrol car rolled away, its red and blue lights cutting streaks through the storm. Maya sat in the back seat, her wrists cuffed tightly in front of her, the metal biting her skin with each bump in the road. Her clothes clung to her body, soaked through from the downpour, her hair plastered against her cheeks. She couldn't stop shivering, not from the cold, but from the aftershock of what had just happened. Every moment replayed in her mind like a cruel film. Eli's small hand slipping weakly against hers, the way his lips had turned blue, the sound of his shallow breaths that nearly disappeared into silence. She had acted because no one else would, because waiting had not been an option. And yet here she was, treated not as someone who saved a child's life, but as a criminal being dragged through the night. Her eyes burned with unshed tears as she turned to look out the rain-streaked window. The city streets blurred past, neon signs flickering against puddles, the occasional pedestrian rushing for cover under umbrellas. Somewhere behind her, in the warmth of the hospital, Eli was hopefully breathing easier. Somewhere beyond those walls, doctors were fighting for him in ways she never could have if she had hesitated. That thought was the only thread keeping her from collapsing under the weight of humiliation and fear. She had done what needed to be done, but at what cost? The officer in the front seat, a younger man with a hardened jaw, didn't look back at her once. His partner, sitting on the passenger side, scrolled lazily through his phone, indifferent to the shivering woman in the back. To them, she wasn't Maya Daniels, a grieving mother who had lost her own son and who couldn't bear to lose another child she'd grown to love. She was just another arrest. Another line in a report, another body processed through the system. They didn't know her story, and even if they did, she doubted they would care. The car jolted to a stop outside the precinct. A squat red brick building with water dripping off its awnings and the faint glow of tired fluorescent lights spilling from its windows. The smell of wet asphalt filled the air as the door was pulled open. "Out!" the officer barked. Maya stumbled onto the pavement, her knees weak, her wrists aching against the cuffs. The rain drenched her again in seconds as they led her through the back entrance. No crowds, no public spectacle, but the humiliation was no less sharp. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed harshly, reflecting off the white-tiled walls that smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. They fingerprinted her, the ink cold and sticky against her skin, then photographed her with a flash that made her blink back tears. She felt stripped bare, as though each step of the process erased the truth of who she was and replaced it with a label she had never earned: criminal. By the time they led her to a holding cell, a small gray box with a metal bench and a single flickering bulb overhead, her body felt heavy as stone. She sank onto the bench, her head in her hands, and let the silence of the cell wrap around her. For the first time since the night began, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, she had never been one for loud displays of grief, but quietly, her shoulders shaking, her tears dripping into her lap. She had saved a life, and yet the world punished her for it. And worse, she thought of Richard Hawthorne, the man who had trusted her enough to let her into his house, yet so easily believed her capable of betrayal. She pictured his tall frame storming into the hospital, rain sliding off his expensive coat, his jaw clenched with fury as he demanded answers. She remembered the way his eyes had looked at her, sharp, accusing, poisoned already by Janelle's whispering voice. He hadn't seen a woman who risked everything to save his son. He had seen only a servant who crossed a line. The metallic clang of the cell door opening jolted her from her thoughts. A man stepped inside, not an officer, but someone different. His presence was quieter, older, worn down by years of carrying the weight of stories like hers. His hair was white at the temples, his face lined with creases that suggested both wisdom and exhaustion. He introduced himself with a low, steady voice, Detective Carl Evans. His badge caught the dim light as he sat on the opposite bench. "Notebook in hand, I read the report," he said, his tone measured. "But reports don't tell the whole story. Why don't you give me yours?" Maya hesitated. For hours no one had asked her that. No one had cared to hear anything beyond the charges. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she began to recount everything: how she had been folding laundry when she found Eli collapsed, how she begged the staff for help and was met with indifference, how the storm had cut off power and phones, how every second she wasted waiting was another second closer to his death. She told him about breaking into the study, about the stacks of cash, about the Tesla keys she grabbed in desperation. She admitted everything, but with the raw truth of someone who had nothing left to lose. Evans listened without interrupting, his pen scratching notes only occasionally. When she spoke of her own son, Tyler, how he had died years ago from a similar condition, how she had carried the guilt of not being fast enough to save him, the detective's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He didn't speak when she finished, just sat in silence for a long moment before finally nodding. "You did what most wouldn't have," he said quietly. "Then why am I in a cell?" She whispered, her throat tight. "Because most wouldn't have done it in his house," Evans replied simply, his voice heavy with the truth of a world where power mattered more than compassion. He stood, tucking his notebook away, and added, "But I'll look into this. Don't lose hope yet." The door shut behind him with a metallic thud that echoed in her chest. Alone again, Maya leaned back against the cold wall, her wrists aching, her eyes burning, but for the first time that night, there was the faintest flicker of hope. Someone had listened. Someone believed her, but even as that hope sparked, she knew the storm had only begun. Richard Hawthorne was a man who valued control above all else, and Janelle was a woman who saw threats where none existed. They would not let her go quietly. She closed her eyes and whispered Eli's name, clinging to the memory of his small fingers clutching her sleeve. He was alive because of her. That truth could not be erased, no matter how many walls or accusations were thrown in her way. In the silence of the cell, Maya vowed that she would endure whatever came next, not for herself, but for the boy who had asked for her when no one else came. For Eli, the weight of the courtroom morning came slowly to the precinct, the first light of dawn crawling across the narrow barred window of Maya's cell, painting the cracked concrete walls in muted gold. She sat slumped on the metal bench, her wrists red from the night of restraints, her body aching from exhaustion. She had barely slept. Every time her eyes drifted shut, she saw Eli's pale face again, his lips tinged blue, his chest trembling with each shallow breath. Each time she jolted awake with the same panicked whisper, "Not again, not like Tyler." But Eli was alive. That thought, however faint, kept her from breaking entirely. The question that gnawed at her heart now was not whether she had saved him. She knew she had, but whether the truth of that mattered in a world where money had the final word. The metallic squeal of the cell door opening startled her. A woman stepped inside, petite but commanding in her presence. She wore a navy blue suit with lines sharp as steel, her hair streaked with gray but tied neatly in a bun. Her glasses perched low on her nose as she studied Maya with piercing eyes. "Maya Daniels," she said, her voice low but steady. "I'm Claire Dorsey. I've been assigned as your public defender." Maya rose slowly, uncertain whether to feel relieved or disappointed. Claire extended a hand, firm and professional, and Maya shook it weakly. "I've reviewed the report, the charges, and the hospital records," Claire continued, sliding a folder from her briefcase onto the bench. "You acted in desperation, but desperation is not a legal defense that wins easily in court. They're charging you with unlawful entry, grand theft, and potential child endangerment." Maya flinched. "Endangerment? I saved him." Her voice cracked. "I know," Claire replied, her gaze softening just slightly. "And the hospital's chief cardiologist agrees you got him there in time. That saved his life." But the prosecution will argue you had no right to remove him, no right to touch the safe, no right to take the vehicle. They'll paint you as reckless, even obsessive. And Richard Hawthorne's lawyers are already circling, eager to make you the villain in a story where they were negligent. Maya sank back onto the bench, her hands. The walk down the precinct corridors felt endless. The cold linoleum floors echoed with each step, the fluorescent lights buzzing above them like impatient bees. Finally, they emerged into a side entrance of the county courthouse, a building that looked far less imposing from the outside than it felt within. Reporters already lingered near the front steps, cameras flashing, microphones waving, their voices carrying rumors into the humid morning air. Through the side hall, Maya was spared the spectacle, but she could feel it all the same, the eyes of the world pressing in, waiting to cast their judgment before a gavel ever struck. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The benches were crowded with local journalists, curious townsfolk, and a few stiff-faced staff from the Hawthorne estate who had likely been ordered to attend. Maya's chest tightened when she saw Esther, the older woman who had trained her. On her first week at the mansion, sitting quietly in the back row, Esther gave the faintest nod, her eyes warm, and for the first time that day, Maya felt a glimmer of strength. At the prosecution's table sat a young assistant district attorney, polished in his gray suit, his expression sharp with ambition. Beside him were two men Maya recognized immediately, Richard Hawthorne's private counsel. They whispered to him even in his absence, as though his authority hovered invisibly over them. Maya sat beside Claire at the defense table, her palms damp, her pulse hammering in her ears. When the judge entered, the room rose. Judge Hastings was a woman with an iron presence, her hair pulled back tightly, her expression unreadable as she settled into her seat. The case was called State of New York versus Maya Daniels. The Ada rose, his voice smooth and cutting. Your Honor, the defendant unlawfully entered her employer's private office, stole over $20,000 in cash, took a vehicle without permission, and transported a minor child against protocol. Her actions may have put the child in greater danger regardless of outcome. She's a clear risk to boundaries, to property, and potentially to the safety of those around her. Maya's stomach twisted, every word digging deeper. She wanted to stand and shout that he was lying, that Eli had been dying, that every second mattered, but Claire placed a steady hand on hers, grounding her. When it was their turn, Claire rose with calm authority. Your Honor, she began, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. The state omits one critical fact. The boy lived because of Maya Daniels. He collapsed in his room during a storm that cut off all power and communication. Staff refused to help. The phones were dead. There was no ambulance, no medical personnel, no parent present. Miss Daniels acted not out of greed, but out of urgency. She did what no one else in that mansion would. She carried a dying child to safety. The Ada scoffed quietly, but Claire pressed on. The hospital's chief cardiologist has already confirmed, had Eli Hawthorne arrived even 20 minutes later, he would not be alive today. That is not speculation, that is fact. Maya Daniels did not endanger him, she saved him. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, some skeptical, others thoughtful. Judge Hastings tapped her gavel lightly. Enough, she said. She leaned back, eyes scanning the papers before her. Finally, she spoke. Bail is set at $25,000. Defendant will remain in custody unless bond is posted. Court adjourned? The gavel struck, and the sound reverberated like a death knell in Maya's chest. $25,000. She didn't have $25 to her name. She was led back to the holding area, her wrists once again bound, her head low as reporters scrambled outside to spin the story however they pleased. To them, she wasn't a woman who had made the impossible choice between theft and a child's death. She was a maid who had crossed into the untouchable world of the rich, and now she would pay for it. Hours later, sitting alone in the narrow cell beneath the courthouse, Maya let her head rest against the wall. The weight of it all threatened to crush her, but then the guard announced a visitor. She was led into a small room, separated from the outside by a pane of scratched glass. On the other side sat Esther, her dark eyes brimming with quiet fire. "They're making you into something." "You're not," Esther said through the phone receiver. "But I know the truth. You saved him. And I'll stand up for you when the time comes." Maya's throat tightened. "Why would you risk that? You know what happens when people stand against them?" "Because silence is how they win," Esther replied firmly. "And I won't be silent while they bury you for doing the right thing." For the first time since the night began, Maya felt something more than despair. She felt the stirrings of resolve. She had faced grief before and survived. She had faced injustice before and endured. And now, though the walls of wealth and power were closing in around her, she realized she wasn't alone. There were still voices willing to rise with hers. She closed her eyes and whispered Eli's name again. The world could paint her a thief, a trespasser, a criminal. But in the heart of one small boy, she knew what she truly was. And that truth, fragile though it was, would be her shield in the storm ahead. Whispers of truth. The courthouse, holding cell, was colder than the precinct, its walls heavy with the weight of too many forgotten voices. Maya sat on the metal bench, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the pale strip of light seeping in from the hallway. She had thought she was past humiliation after the arrest, after the mugshot, after being led in shackles before strangers. But the judge's words, "Bail is set at $25,000, had cut deeper than the cuffs. It was a number so far beyond her reach that it might as well have been 100,000. And though she had saved Eli's life, she realized in that moment that money could erase truth as easily as a rag wiped dust off marble floors. When the door opened again, her defender, Claire Dorsey, stepped in. She carried herself like a woman who lived on caffeine and iron resolve. Her glasses perched low as she laid another folder onto the table. "I won't lie to you," Claire began, her voice quiet but direct. "They're going to fight tooth and nail to keep you painted as the villain. Hawthorne's lawyers are already pushing for headlines that describe you as obsessed with Eli, reckless with his health and unstable. They're spinning this as a narrative where you endangered him to insert yourself into his life." Maya's heart dropped. "That's a lie," she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, she knew lies often traveled faster than truth. "I know it's a lie," Claire said firmly, "but we need more than your word. We need evidence, we need witnesses." "The hospital records prove Eli was in critical condition, but the prosecution will argue you made things worse. Our strongest chance is to show neglect on the estate's part, that no one else acted, that you were left without options. If we can demonstrate that, then we flip the narrative. Who would even stand with me?" Maya asked bitterly. "The staff won't, they'd lose their jobs. And Richard, he's already chosen to see me as a thief." Claire leaned forward. "Not everyone sees you that way. A nurse named Valerie from the A has come forward. She said she saw everything, the way you carried Eli in, the way Richard dismissed you even after doctors confirmed you saved his son. She said it didn't sit right with her and she's willing to testify." Maya's breath caught. The thought of anyone outside that cold mansion standing for her sent warmth through her chest. "She testify?" "She's already filed a statement," Claire confirmed. "And Esther has contacted me too. She's not afraid to speak out about the culture in that house, how staff were discouraged from caring for Eli. That kind of testimony matters because it shows your act wasn't reckless, it was necessary." For the first time since her arrest, a small ember of hope flickered in Maya's chest, but Claire wasn't finished. She opened her folder and pulled out another paper. "There's something else. The security footage from the night of the incident is conveniently missing. System logs show manual deletions. Someone didn't want the cameras showing what really happened." Maya blinked. "Janelle," she said without hesitation, her voice trembling. "She hated that I cared for him. She would rather see me buried than admit she ignored him." Claire didn't confirm, but her silence spoke volumes. "If we prove tampering," she said, "we don't just weaken the charges, we turn the spotlight back onto them. And Richard Hawthorne, for all his power, doesn't like a spotlight he can't control." Hours later, Maya was escorted back to her cell, but her steps felt steadier. She wasn't alone anymore. Esther, Valerie, even Claire, who carried no illusions but fought with iron, slowly. The silence of the mansion was being cracked open, and whispers of truth were slipping through. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Hawthorne stood in his penthouse office staring out across the skyline. The sun had dipped behind steel towers, leaving the city bathed in the orange glow of dusk. He had pale but alive, whispering her name. Not his, not Janelle's, Maya. She broke into your study, Janelle pressed. She stole your money. She drove your car without permission. She doesn't belong in our lives, Richard. She belongs behind bars. The sooner this trial buries her, the better. Richard finally turned, his eyes hard. She saved him, he said quietly. Janelle scoffed. Or she staged the whole thing. You think it's a coincidence she just happened to be there, just happened to find him? Open your eyes. She's playing you, Richard. But Richard's mind wasn't convinced. He had built empires by trusting numbers, by weighing risks, by seeing angles others missed. Yet, with his own son, he had been blind. He hadn't noticed Eli's declining health, hadn't seen the signs that Maya had seen. And that truth dug into him more painfully than Janelle's words, when the meeting with his lawyers came later. That evening, Richard gave them his orders in a voice sharp as glass. Push the charges forward. Do whatever it takes to win. But his voice faltered for a fraction of a second. Keep her name out of the front-page headlines. I don't want Eli reading it. As they nodded and scribbled notes, Richard turned once more toward the city lights. He told himself he was doing the right thing, protecting his legacy, his estate, his family. But deep down, he knew there was a crack in that reasoning. Because the only reason Eli was still alive wasn't his wealth, his lawyers, or his mansion. It was her back in her cell. Maya clutched the small laminated photo Esther had slipped to her, a photo of Tyler, her own son, smiling with bright eyes the world had stolen too soon. She pressed it to her heart and whispered into the stillness. They think they can bury me, but I've already lived through the worst. I won't stop now, not for me, for him, for Eli. And though the walls were thick, though the gavel had sounded against her name, though the world outside was stacked against her, something new burned in Maya's chest that night. Not just grief, not just fear, but resolve, the kind born only in people who had already lost everything once before and learned that nothing, not even power, could silence truth forever. The cracks in the mask the city woke restless the morning. Maya's bail review was scheduled. Though the courthouse was smaller than the grand chamber where her arraignment had taken place, there was no shortage of eyes waiting to judge. The public had already been fed a steady stream of headlines. Maid. Or menace? Theft disguised as heroism? The Hawthorne scandal no one saw coming. Yet amid the noise, there were quieter voices whispering a different story, one that refused to be silenced. A nurse's statement leaked to a journalist. An editorial questioning the silence of the estate. A photo of Eli, pale but awake in his hospital bed, circulated online with the caption, "He asked for her by name." It was only a flicker, but it was enough to unsettle the narrative Janelle and the lawyers had worked so hard to craft. Maya stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands folded tightly together, her heart hammering as though it might break through her ribs. Claire was beside her, calm and collected, her navy suit crisp, her files tucked neatly under her arm. "Remember," Claire said softly, "you don't have to prove to them that you're perfect. You just have to remind them you're human and that Eli is alive because of you." "I'm not afraid of them," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm afraid of what they can do to the truth." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's always the battle. But we're not walking in empty-handed anymore." When the bail hearing began, the prosecutor wasted no time. He painted Maya as manipulative, reckless, a woman who had inserted herself into a child's life for personal reasons. Her actions, he said, his voice smooth and confident, were not the selfless heroism she claims, but the dangerous overreach of an employee who broke every boundary. She endangered the boy by removing him without medical authorization, and she endangered the sanctity of the household she was entrusted to serve. The words dripped with contempt, as though her very existence was a blemish on the marble perfection of the Hawthorne name. Maya's fists clenched under the table, but she forced herself to stay still. Then Claire rose. She moved without theatrics. Her voice steady, deliberate. Your Honor, the state calls this recklessness. I call it survival. A 9-year-old child collapsed in a mansion full of staff who turned their backs. The phones were dead. The storm cut off communication. No ambulance was coming. Mr. Hawthorne was away. Miss Daniels was the only one who chose not to stand by and watch him die. She acted because no one else would. And because of her, he is alive today? The courtroom stirred, whispers running through the benches. Claire pressed forward, her eyes flashing. We have testimony from medical staff at Mercy Hills who confirmed the boy arrived in critical condition, seconds from irreversible damage. We have witnesses who saw him ask for Maya Daniels by name when he woke up. Not his father, not the so-called lady of the house. That is not obsession. That is recognition. Children don't lie about who comforts them in their weakest moments. The judge listened in silence, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades spent cutting through deception. Bail will be reduced to $5,000, bond acceptable. Defendant is to surrender her passport and remain within county limits until trial. The gavel's sharp strike rang like a crack in the mansion's marble mask. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was the first step. 5,000 was still beyond Maya's means, but as she was led from the room, Esther rose quietly from the benches. She approached Claire, her hands clutching an envelope. It's not much, she said softly, but the church gathered what we could. She deserves to walk free while she waits for her day. That afternoon, when Maya stepped out of the courthouse into the pale sunlight, she felt air on her face that wasn't filtered through iron bars or buzzing fluorescence. She inhaled deeply, the weight of the cell lifting, if only slightly. She wasn't free, not truly, but for the first time in days she could see the sky without bars between them. Claire drove her to a modest safe house offered by a women's advocacy group, its small rooms quiet and unadorned but blessedly free of cameras and whispers. That night, sitting by the window of the safe house, Maya held Tyler's photo in her hands. She traced his smile with her thumb, whispering as she always did, I couldn't save you, but I saved him. Tears stung her eyes, but for once they weren't only of grief, they were of resolve. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Hawthorne sat in the study Maya had once broken into, the bourbon glass untouched on his desk. The safe stood closed and locked, as though mocking him with its cold metal silence. Janelle paced behind him, her heels tapping sharply against the hardwood floor. You can't be wavering on this, Richard, she said sharply. The media's already running wild. If you soften now, they'll think you've lost control. Investors will ask questions. The board will question your judgment. Richard stared at the photo on his desk, a small frame of Eli smiling weakly from a hospital visit years ago. He asked for her, he said quietly. She manipulated him, Janelle snapped. Can't you see it? She staged this entire thing. To get your sympathy, to get into your life, she's dangerous. But Richard's silence lingered. For all his wealth, all his power, he couldn't ignore what gnawed at him. Maya had acted when he hadn't. Maya had noticed what he had been too blind to see. And his son, his fragile, precious boy, was alive not because of his fortune, but because of her courage. That truth weighed heavier than any fortune he had ever counted. Later that night, while Janelle slept in the master suite, Richard found himself pacing the darkened halls of the mansion. The walls felt colder, the silence heavier. He remembered Eli's small hand gripping his in the hospital, his weak voice whispering, Maya saved me. It echoed through him, louder than the storm had, louder than Janelle's accusations, louder than his lawyer's polished words. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unfamiliar, shame, back at the safe house. Maya's phone buzzed unexpectedly. She answered cautiously, her heart skipping when a faint, trembling voice whispered, Maya? It was Eli. His words were quiet, hurried as though he wasn't supposed to be calling. I just wanted to say, thank you. Daddy doesn't talk much, but I told him you saved me. I told him you're the only one who cared. Maya pressed a hand to her mouth, her chest breaking with both joy and sorrow. I'm right here, baby. I'm not going anywhere. Before she could say more, a nurse's voice called in the background. Eli whispered, "Don't give up, please." And then the line went dead. Maya sat frozen, the phone clutched in her hand, tears streaming silently down her face. She had endured grief, humiliation, chains, and accusations. But that small, trembling voice reminded her why she would keep enduring. Not for herself, not even for her name, but for the boy who still believed in her when no one else did. And somewhere in the mansion's darkened halls, Richard Hawthorne sat awake long past midnight, wondering if perhaps for the first time he had been wrong about everything. The breaking of chains, the trial was set for a Thursday morning, the kind of day when the sky itself seemed to mirror the tension of the city. Heavy gray clouds pressed low, smothering the skyline in gloom, while flashes of sun broke through occasionally like brief promises of light amid darkness. Maya stood in the courthouse hallway, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks that Claire had insisted on. Her wrists no longer shackled, but her hands still trembling with the memory of cold iron. She had slept little the night before, haunted by visions of Tyler and Eli overlapping in her dreams, one boy gone too soon and another clinging to life because of her. Today she knew the world would try to erase her truth, and yet for the first time she walked into the storm not alone. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy. Journalists filled the benches, pens and tablets at the ready, their whispers humming like locusts. Curious townsfolk had crowded in, their faces eager for spectacle. At the prosecution's table, the assistant district attorney looked polished and hungry, his eyes gleaming as though this case were a prize to mount on his career wall. Richard Hawthorne was not seated beside him, but rather in the gallery, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight as though carved from stone. Janelle sat near him, her arms folded, her gaze sharp with venom, diamonds at her ears catching the courtroom light like shards of ice. When the bailiff called the case, Maya rose with Claire at her side. She felt every gaze cut into her, but she held her chin high. She was no longer just the maid who blended into walls. She was the woman who had carried a boy through a storm while the world looked away. The prosecutor began with fire. He painted her as a manipulative figure who had used a child's vulnerability to gain access to money and influence. He spoke of theft, of boundaries broken, of obsessive fixation. His words dripped with contempt, and he gestured grandly toward the Hawthorne name as though it were a fortress above reproach. Then Claire rose. She did not raise her voice. She did not embellish with theatrics. She simply began with a single question. Where was everyone else when Eli Hawthorne lay gasping on the floor? The courtroom stilled. Claire let the silence linger, heavy and cutting. Then she continued, her voice low but fierce. She spoke of the storm that knocked out power, of the staff who refused to act, of the phones that were dead, of a child left alone in a mansion filled with adults who looked the other way. Maya Daniels did not break into an office out of greed, Claire said, each word deliberate. She broke into it because no one else would break the silence. She carried him through a storm while others slept, while others turned their backs. And he is alive today because of her choice. The defense called Valerie, the nurse, who testified that Eli had been minutes away from death and that Maya had arrived soaked, shaking but holding him with the desperate love of someone who could not let go. Valerie's voice did not waver. When she told the court, that boy whispered her name when he woke up, not his father's, not anyone else's, hers. Then Esther was called. The older woman's hands trembled slightly as she held the Bible and swore her oath, but her eyes burned with quiet conviction. She told the court how the staff had been instructed never to touch Eli unless explicitly ordered, how Janelle dismissed his cries as weakness, how silence was enforced in that house like another rule of service. We were told to stay away. Esther said, her voice breaking. But Maya didn't. She saw him. She listened, and she saved him. Whispers rippled through the benches, doubt threading its way into the prosecution's tidy narrative. And then, unexpectedly, Richard Hawthorne himself rose. Gasps echoed across the room. The prosecutor frowned, unprepared for his own benefactor to step forward. The judge allowed it. Richard walked to the stand, his towering presence suddenly subdued, his gaze fixed not on the lawyers but on the woman seated quietly at the defense table. His voice, when he began, was low and unsteady. "I was blinded," he admitted. "Blinded by power, by pride, by the belief that money could protect my son better than people could. I hired staff, I installed machines, I built walls of marble and steel. But when it mattered, when my son's heart stopped in